Hi, everyone. Welcome to the SEC's Final Rules on Climate-Related Disclosures session provided by RGP. I'm Janis Parthun, and in this session today, I'll be highlighting regulatory developments specifically related to SEC's final rules issued this month. A little about myself. I'm a finance and a risk leader, a VP within our consulting services team at RGP. I currently lead thought leadership programs and service innovation on emerging finance and risk issues. I'm also the ESG consulting services leader overseeing methodology and go-to-market development at RGP. With RGP is a global consulting company that serves over 2,200 clients, which includes 87 of the Fortune 100. RGP enables rapid business outcomes by bringing together the right people who together create transformative change. And it's daring to work differently to deliver the future of work today. So for today's agenda today, what I would like to do is cover and discuss the final SEC rule on climate-related disclosures, applicable timelines, and comparison across some of the other US regulations, and then provide some ESG resources. I like to emphasize, though, that the objective of this brief session is to really just bring awareness to you and highlight some of the key changes in the final rules and versus what was originally proposed. Our RGP team members can really help you navigate through this more intricate details and specifically how this applies to your organization. As most of you may know, the SEC proposed rules back in March of 2022 to enhance and standardize the climate-related disclosures as the investor community is demanding for more consistent, comparable, and reliable information across companies. Well, the time has come. The final SEC rules are here. On March 6th, the SEC commissioners voted and adopted rules to enhance and standardize climate-related disclosures by public companies and in public offerings. And the final rules issued include a number of significant disclosure requirements. It's all described in a document over 800 pages. Now, you may ask, what does this mean to me? Or how does this apply to my organization? Again, I want to emphasize that the objective of this brief session is to bring awareness to you and highlight the key changes in the final rules versus what we originally proposed or what was originally proposed. And our RGP team members can really help you navigate through the more intricate details and specifically how this applies to you. So these are just really key highlights that I wanted to share for this brief session. So first, what I want to note is that the final rule is still consistently aligned with the TCFD, or the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and its framework. You can see here that the related disclosure requirements have a similar structure in the order of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. With governance, this is oversight by the board of directors of climate-related risk and any role by management in assessing and managing the material climate-related risk. With strategy, this is around climate-related risks that have had or are reasonably likely to have material impact on the company's business strategy, the results of operations, or financial condition. And this includes quantitative and qualitative descriptions on material expenditures, along with transition plans, scenario analysis, or internal carbon prices if any of the last three mentioned applies. With risk management, this pertains to processes for identifying, assessing, managing material climate-related risk, and if managing those risks, whether and how such processes are integrated into the company's overall risk management system. With metrics and targets, This relates to climate-related targets or goals that have materially affected or are reasonably likely to materially affect the company's business, results of operations, or financial position. And this also includes material expenditures, material impacts on financial estimates and assumptions, and carbon offsets as a component to achieve the targets and goals. Now, I'd like to dig a little deeper here to share with you. So taking a closer look at the final rules, there are a number of key changes from what was proposed, and I've highlighted them here. So the red is indicating that the requirement was removed, and the blue indicating modified, or at least blue, green, teal. So you can see here, in general, what was removed was to disclose the impact of severe weather events, natural conditions, transition activities at the individual line item level of a company's consolidated financial statements. What was modified was more of to adopt a less prescriptive approach, extending certain phased-in periods, and more specifically, disclose the financial statement effects on capital costs and expenditures. So essentially transitioning from the multiple line items to specifically capital costs and expenditures. Within governance, what was removed was to describe the board members' climate expertise. Within strategy, what was modified was to qualify the requirements to provide certain climate-related disclosures based on materiality and specifically disclose related material expenditures. Now, with materiality, I do want to note that this is a significant topic that was brought up multiple times within the final rules. I'm not going to be elaborating in this brief session, but this is a very significant area that companies will need to further evaluate and define. Now, with targets and goals, what was modified and observed was that carbon offsets are specifically identified to disclose in filing if applicable. And with attestation for greenhouse gas emissions, what was removed was for applying that to smaller reporting companies or emerging growth companies subject to emissions disclosure requirements. And also the big thing that was removed was having to provide Scope 3 emissions disclosure. What's also modified here was that having to extend reasonable assurance phase for the phase-in period for large accelerated filers, and having to require limited assurance only for the accelerated filers. There's also an option to provide disclosure on a delayed basis. I do want to repeat again that materiality was brought up a number of times, and this was again highlighted in the final rules in relations to material Scope 1 emissions and or Scope 2 emissions. So I'm not going to elaborate in this brief session, but this is a very significant area that companies will need to further evaluate and define. In terms of other information, wanted to also call out in terms of what was removed was to disclose any material changes to the climate-related disclosures provided in the registration statement or annual report in a Form 10Q. So essentially, if you were reporting this annually and you have significant changes in between that, you no longer need to be reporting in between that time frame. In terms of what's modified is having to extend a safe harbor to the registrant's transition plan, scenario analysis, and internal carbon pricing and targets and goals. Which this means that a company has safe harbor from private liability for certain disclosures that's noted within this area, other than historical facts. So I want to emphasize that there are additional changes not listed here within the final rules. It's really a significant number of discussion points and things of that sort within the 800 pages. So not everything is going to be called out here. There are so many other elements, but these are the key elements that I wanted to call out. And it's best for companies to really go through an in-depth analysis around this. So in terms of what this means to you and how does this apply to your organization, these are the key compliance dates under the final rules. So you'll notice that the key changes I highlighted earlier include extending the phase-in period, having to remove the Scope 3 disclosure requirements. Those are a few areas. But now I'm going to walk through this by the company filer category. So for large accelerated filers, you can see that the phase-in period extending out with initial disclosures required starting in fiscal year beginning 2025, and disclosure requirements to report on material expenditures pertaining to the climate-related risk, as well as progress on targets and goals applicable starting the following year, and the requirements for the limited assurance applicable starting fiscal year beginning 2029. So this essentially means that if you have a fiscal year end of 12/31, you're essentially reporting on your 2025 information in the calendar year 2026, and then with the limited assurance to complete in 2030. With accelerated filers, this applicability starts 1 year after the large accelerated filers, and you can see here in the fiscal year beginning 2026 and having to report in the calendar year 2027. And as mentioned earlier, the rules have modified to have the limited assurance only. And then as I mentioned earlier, for the non-accelerated filers, smaller reporting companies, or the emerging growth companies, this group is exempt from reporting the greenhouse gas emissions, although there are still disclosure requirements to report on material expenditures pertaining to climate-related risk, as well as the progress on targets and goals. Now, that was just a quick highlight in terms of the SEC's final rules. And I wanted to also just focus this from a larger, from a US perspective, from a regulations perspective. So here are other significant laws to consider. So I'm presenting this side by side here, and it's all climate focused. And I went through and discussed the aspects of the SEC final rules listed at a high level, but just want to also remind companies about the California laws. So you can see here, California had issued and signed 2 state bills into law late last year, requiring companies to report their carbon emission related activities. The SB 253 is anticipated to apply to over 5,000 companies, public or private. And to dive a little bit deeper, you can see here in terms of from a bullet points perspective, the SB 253 having to require to disclose the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions in 2026, and then having to disclose Scope 3 in 2027. And these are for companies with revenues greater than 1 billion that do business in California, public or private. So keeping that in mind. And then having to address limited assurance along with reasonable assurance in the respective years. And then with SB 261, this is in relations to disclosing the climate-related financial risk starting in 2026 and then afterwards every 2 years. And this pertains to US companies that do business in California and with revenues greater than 500 million, public as well as private. So just also to be wanting to make sure you're aware in terms of the SB 253. So when this is in reference to disclosing in 2026, this is for 2025 data and information. And then when it comes to revenue, this is for all revenue, not just revenue earned in California in applicability. So as you can see, these multiple regulations and requirements side by side, this SB 253 is a bit broader in that this also applies to private companies, but they all have their various nuances associated, as you can tell, previously discussed, and then also just highlighted here at a high level. Now, in terms of what's next with SB 253, we're waiting for the California Air Resource Board, who will be overseeing the reporting and the compliance on the assurance. And they will be rolling out reporting guidelines for implementation. And I would anticipate that they would have a digital reporting platform to submit the information, but there will also be likely more details around what would constitute doing business in California. For SB 261, the submissions will be reviewed by an advisory group within the governor's office, and similarly, more details to come. So as you're navigating through these reporting requirements, it is important to seek the help where it's possible and evaluate what stage your organization is at with the information that you have. And now lastly, international perspective, these regulations may also be on the top of your minds as well. I'm not going to be going into detail here, but it's definitely another layer of disclosure requirements to consider. And a reminder to all that multiple regulations now in force, you really want to be able to spend the time to assess and determine and get the help that you need to support you in order to address these various demands. So I hope you found the regulatory update on the SEC climate disclosure rules helpful and informative today. What I shared only touches the surface. I want to be able to also share the resources we have, which includes the listing here. And I like to also share the service we offer with you in a bit detail as well. So if you also, because not necessarily having to have access to these links, if you go to the website that's referred to here, you will be able to see a variety of other resources available that's also pointed out here. And I also have my contact information if you have any further questions. Now, in terms of our consulting services around ESG reporting, you can see here there are two key reporting work streams here. And to expand further, true reporting work streams, meaning from annual report or regulatory filing, and then the other work stream, the sustainability reporting on your website or your impact report. And to expand a little bit further, these services illustrate how RGP can help companies address the organizational needs around ESG reporting. Each functional area, from technical accounting, operational reporting, and risk and compliance, we can help clients address any challenges that you have around these areas. And this may be from the regulatory perspective that I just went through, from SEC perspective, California rules, things of that sort, and having to understand what your current state is. From an operational reporting perspective, this may be looking at your sustainability program and having to understand in terms of your reporting efforts and how that aligns to the voluntary standards and frameworks. And then here in the middle, from a risk and compliance perspective, having to understand from your ESG metrics perspective, how likely you're be ready to be audited, or do you have confidence in terms of the information that you have currently presented externally and publicly? And there's an interesting research study that was conducted recently by Protiviti. It was a 2023 Global Finance Trends survey report. And interesting enough, ESG was elevated to #1 as the finance leaders' top priority. And this is a survey over 900 finance leaders. So if you haven't started the process of mapping out your strategy and roadmap to address and start out your journey, now this is the time in order to be able to stay ahead of all these evolving requirements. And we're here to help. So this concludes our session for today. If you have any specific questions about the presentation, you can reach out to me with the email contact listed here. And I thank you for your time.